Welcome to The Coaching Corner, a podcast for coaches coaching in the child welfare field. I'm your host, James Coloma, and on today's episode, we'll be talking about cultural humility. We'll explore the difference between cultural competency and cultural humility. We'll look into how to blend both of these topics into making your practice better. And we'll look into how some real-life examples of cultural humility and cultural humility in action. In a moment, Darlene Hill will join us on today's episode to help us understand more about this topic. I'm James Coloma, and we'll be right back. Good morning, Darlene.
Good morning, James.
How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. Tell us a little about yourself.
So I am Darlene Hill. I'm born and raised in California. Grew up in a small farming community in Fresno County, then moved to San Diego, the Bay Area, and now I'm back in San Diego. I've been working in child welfare training for about 9 years.
Okay, that's great. So you're the first person to give us some history about where you were born. We're talking today about cultural humility. Is that something that is involved in cultural humility?
Absolutely. Where you're from and the type of community you grew up in, whether it's rural or urban, small or large, and the demographics of those communities greatly influences who you are.
So, okay, you've talked a little bit about cultural humility. What is cultural humility? And, I've heard another topic about cultural competency. What's the difference between those two?
So cultural competence is what we've been taught for many, many years in social work, and that is really, when I was in grad school, it was the chapters in the book about each different race or ethnicity. So you had one on African Americans, and everything you needed to know about African Americans came from that one chapter, and similarly, everything on Asians and now Asian Pacific Islander, because we reclassified that, would come from that one chapter. And so once you learned all that content, then you could be labeled as culturally competent. But cultural humility takes us a step further in acknowledging that everybody's culture is unique and individual to them, and really we shouldn't be making assumptions based on stereotypes, but we should be asking about how their individual culture is created and what they feel is important to them.
So it's not like we're throwing cultural competence out the window. Is it still important to understand, in general, this is the African American culture, this is the Asian Pacific Islander culture? Is that still important? And then taking it a step further is what we're working towards now?
Right. Yeah, I think that it's important to still have some basic understanding and use those as sort of clues to kind of help guide and direct you when you're talking about cultural humility.
So what's the downfall then by just knowing cultural competence? So where do we get stuck, and why are we moving in this way into cultural humility?
So where we get stuck is assuming that everybody from that culture can be attributed to the things that we assume about that culture.
And is it right to understand that even though that I may say that I'm Filipino, my Filipino background may be different than somebody else's growth in their Filipino culture?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, there's some things like I may know that Filipinos have two main dialects, Tagalog and Ilocano, but I may not assume that because you're from north of the Philippines that you speak Ilocano. Maybe your family speaks more Tagalog, or they speak a separate dialect and don't speak either of the dominant. So I need to just ask you and really inquire about your family's culture.
So cultural humility then is a series of asking questions. So tell us a little bit more about cultural humility then.
Yeah, it's asking questions to kind of get to what a family values and in their family system, in their family makeup, and it really explores where they came from that led to them to have those set belief systems.
So is cultural humility then the combination of not just race and ethnicity, but includes everything else, such as where were you born, your socioeconomic status, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion, all of that then is involved in understanding who somebody else is?
right? Culture has been expanded now in the concept of cultural humility from just race and ethnicity to all those other aspects of life that we know impact us, such as socioeconomic, such as gender, such as sexual orientation, and all of that comes with those.
Okay. So that sounds like a lot to be asking a family. How do you ask around cultural humility when you're sitting down and working with the family?
I think you can keep it general and ask some basic questions such as what's important to your family. Tell me a little bit about your family and what you feel are important. How do you deal with discipline in your family? Those kind of general questions will get you to what's important to them.
So when you were giving us those examples, it sounds to me like you may be asking around their culture about what may be presented in their case.
Absolutely.
So when we're asking about discipline, I'd imagine it's because it might be a physical abuse case that we're working on. So that's a great start. So tell us, do you have any real-life examples about how you've used cultural humility in your practice?
Yeah, I use it on a regular basis because I am biracial and because my husband is from a different race than myself. So every day in my real life I use this because I have to. I have to learn about my own culture and take that into account and make sure that I'm not coming from my own place of bias and prejudice. And when I'm sitting down and talking to somebody, I actually see them for the person that they are. So I feel like cultural humility comes from a place of respect and not a place of I know everything. And so that's the basic underpinning of it. But I met somebody who was from Eritrea, and I had never met anyone from there before, and so I looked it up on the internet to find out where is it at and what are some things about it, and then I went back to this person and said, I looked it up, and it's East Africa, and can you tell me a little bit more about your culture, because I'm really curious. And so it's a place of curiosity.
Okay. That's great. Is that why when you introduced yourself at the start of this podcast, you gave us a little bit of information about who you were? When you're working with a family, do you also do that? Do you share about your own cultural background?
I typically do, and it gets interwoven at some point in time because of the way I look, people assume I'm either this or that. And so in order to either make a connection with them or to clarify who I am, then usually some aspect about my personal culture does come up.
So it's an engagement strategy as well, to be culturally humble when working with somebody else.
Right, absolutely. That's like the base level of how you get to know the people and how you find some commonalities with them.
What other examples do you have of either your practice or somebody else's, what you've heard other people's practice, where they really struggled around understanding somebody else's culture, and how did they break down those barriers?
I think it comes down to having candid conversations. I know there are some races that don't understand each other and come from very different perspectives. So it really is having what we call a courageous conversation. When somebody offends you, you really just want to say, that really was a offensive comment, and then talk about why and talk about what they can do in the future to prevent doing that.
That's nice. I really like how you talk about being honest about your own feelings and using that to connect with somebody else to let them know that they might have offended you. And that was a nice way to phrase that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important when working with families. If you're trying to build their trust, you need to let them know that if I say something that offends you, it's not intentional, and I really want you to let me know.
So as a very novice individual in this topic, how would I go about then broaching this conversation with a family? Do I just say, tell me about your religion? Or is there a way that is, what language do you use?
I would just say keep it general and then drill down from there and just say, what's important to your family? What is your family value? Or if it's around the holiday season, it's like, does your family do anything during the holidays? If so, what do they do? And then you really get a sense and you get a lot more information about their family and their culture and their belief systems if you ask it from that standpoint.
So, this is a podcast around how do you coach in the child welfare field. So we've been talking a lot about the examples of how a caseworker or a worker may interact with their family. Can we also make the leap to how coaches work with the child welfare professionals?
Yeah, I think they can coach to this concept and make sure that, we always talk about how we want to leave our personal biases at the door. And so I think this blends nicely with that. And so you may explore in coaching whether this family is really difficult for you to work with because of some cultural aspect, or they can prompt the worker with some questions to ask the family about their personal culture to get to an understanding of why the maltreatment happened and what are the appropriate services for that family's culture to put in place to prevent further maltreatment.
Okay, so I think that's great. I think that gives me some context around if I was going into coach. One of my jobs would be to help the worker understand where their struggles might be with the family,
right.
And it might be around culture, right. And to help that worker either explore what that family's culture is or maybe give the worker some tips around next time you go and meet with the family, what if we explore some aspect of their culture?
Right.
Do you think it might be important for me as a coach to also explore culture with the person that I'm coaching too?
I think you can. It's always, the more you get to know the people you're working with, the easier it is oftentimes to work with them and to build that relationship and build that trust. You need to give a piece of yourself sometimes and let people know this is my culture, this is where I'm coming from with my perspective, and then it creates a greater level of understanding and compassion for people and a greater level of tolerance. When things irk you, they might not irk you so bad if you understand where the people are coming from.
These have been great tips, Darlene. Is there anything else you want to share with us around cultural humility?
I just think it's a great concept, and it's something that you can use in every aspect of your everyday life. And so if you come from a place of respect, it makes life easier.
That's great. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Thank you, James.
Well, thank you, Darlene. I appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. All right, we'll be right back. You've been listening to The Coaching Corner from the Public Child Welfare Training Academy Radio through the Academy for Professional Excellence at San Diego State University School of Social Work. For more information about the Academy for Professional Excellence and the services we offer, please visit us on the web at theacademy.sdsu.edu. You can also subscribe to the Academy for Professional Excellence's YouTube channel by searching for the Academy SDSU. If you want to let us know if we were culturally humble with each other during this podcast, please send us an email to jcoloma@mail.sdsu.edu, and in the subject line, reference the title of this podcast. A special thank you to our guest today, Darlene Hill, whose knowledge about cultural humility helped me to understand more about maybe where I come from. Please join us next time as we explore other topics in the child welfare arena. I'm your host, James Coloma, and now go out there and inspire and innovate our child welfare field.